I've been spending a lot of time on Twitter recently because I'm anxious and it makes me more anxious to do so. But that's, and so I'll share a couple tweets in my presentation. This was one yesterday from the folks who organized this series of webinars, the Economics for the Anthropocene or Leadership for the Ecozoic Network. And it says, need a break from COVID-19. Join our webinar. And to that I responded, oh gosh, I'm not supposed to talk about coronavirus. And so I decided to title my presentation, Food That's Not for Sale in a Hypothetical Non-Pandemic Related Crisis That Leaves Many People Without Income. But since then I changed my mind and I'm just gonna talk about food that's not for sale in a pandemic because that's what's going on. And it's hard not to talk about. The pandemic's alarming and it activates our fight or flight responses and we want to do something about it. But for lots of us, especially, the subset of the population who's on a webinar right now, probably the best thing we can do about it most days is stay home. And so then we end up talking about it because that feels like doing something about it and our minds are on coronavirus. And before I go farther, I'll say to those of you here who do have essential jobs and are working to take care of the sick or to take care of essential things like food, thank you. Super appreciate that. Everyone who's at grocery stores and food shelves and just food distribution warehouses and on farms, that work hasn't stopped because people have to eat. And so I'll get to that food system stuff a little more in a second. But yeah, as a worker who's discovered that I'm non-essential, as many of us have, and I'm now at home telecommuting, that same wanting to do something about having our, that same wanting to do something about coronavirus or having my mind on coronavirus leads us to social media and the news a lot because there's a lot to be outraged about. Our leaders are talking about how human sacrifice is necessary for, to appease the gods of economic growth right now. And there's also a lot to be encouraged about, and that's what I'm going to mainly focus on. But yeah, there's a lot going on. So I saw this tweet yesterday from a Bloomberg article about how restaurant suppliers have a bunch of food because of the restaurants are mostly closed. And the tweet says, what if they just gave it away to people who need it? There's this need, there's hungry people, more so than in normal times because many people are hoarding, many people are without income. The people who work at restaurants might be at risk of hunger now because restaurants are shut down and they might be out of work. So how do we get that food to the people who need it? Now, there's all these different ways that food gets to people, and I like to divide them between market and non-market institutions. And the basic way that we make that division is, do you pay for the food? So in market institutions, that's like a restaurant where you go to pay for the food. And a non-market institution is like community meal. Think of a cafeteria where you pay for the food, or a dinner party where maybe, people bought the ingredients, but you don't go to a dinner party and pay. But those are all examples of institutions that aren't happening right now in a pandemic. And so that puts extra pressure on other types of institutions. So some restaurants here in Burlington are like focusing entirely on takeout and probably losing money doing so. Soup kitchens can't shut down, so they're trying to reorient themselves toward takeout. Supermarkets are continuing to stay open, but changing a lot of their practices for food safety reasons, and the same goes for food pantries. Here in Burlington, the food shelf is both our biggest soup kitchen and food pantry, and they've totally reorganized everything they've done. Many of their volunteers are over 70 and they're telling them to stay home, and so trying to get new volunteers out to package up every individual meal, to package up every individual box of groceries that people are picking up for free. It's a really heroic effort, and it's really impressive to see the non-market food institutions from around Vermont doing that. I should say my dissertation research is on non-market food in Vermont, so I have kind of my eye on what's going on. And so, yeah, huge surge in demand at the food shelf in Burlington. And, we see collaboration between the market and the non-market institutions in the city market. Our main grocer here in downtown Burlington is packaging up a bunch of individual meals for the food shelf in their community kitchen. Schools are closed, but kids still got to eat. The school districts here, and as in many places, one thing they serve as is food distribution institutions, and that part of the food, or that part of the school district has to remain open. So they've gone, in the blink of an eye to their sort of summer program where they're distributing meals in different places around town. But what about all this food that's stuck with the restaurant suppliers? And what about all the people who are without income and, can't, even in normal times, we know that transportation is the biggest barrier for people getting food assistance in Vermont, even in densely populated places in Vermont, like Chittenden County. So there's a bakery and cafe here in Burlington called August 1st, and the bakery's still open. They're making bread, selling it to grocery stores as they do. They're doing a limited takeout menu and getting some business from that, but their supplier has all this excess food and is selling things at super discounted prices. So August 1st right now is buying extra food, just knowing that they're going to give it away. And I organize a group called Food Not Bombs Burlington, and we're partnering with Burlington Cop Watch. And Burlington Cop Watch, they exist to follow the cops around and film what they do with smartphones for accountability's sake. But they've totally reorganized in the last week and a half to do mutual aid work. So we partnered to do these food drops. And for us, this is just like for the food shelves, changing everything we do. We normally put food security before food safety, but now it's like, how do we get food to people who are hungry without infecting them, especially people experiencing homelessness here? They're some of the most visible people who don't have access to sufficient quantities of food. So we're doing these food drops around town just about every day. Actually missing out on one right now to do this presentation. And this is kind of what it looks like. There's some bus stops and other places where folks are often hanging out that we bring food in, and also other basic supplies like handkerchiefs for people to put over their faces, whatever folks need to be and feel safe. And, I've seen on the internet, this sort of mutual aid work is happening in so many places around the world right now, from religious groups, and just spontaneously organized among neighbors, and on, there's tons of Facebook groups popping up, like post your leftover food and then people will come take it. So mutual aid is sort of this fill in the gaps kind of non-institutional or non-bureaucratic voluntary collectives that are getting food to people who need it for free. And that's a really important part of the food system in any time, and it's really ramping up here in the crisis. And some, hardcore mutual aid aficionados are sort of like appalled that the New York Times is writing about mutual aid today, for example, and co-opting this concept that has these radical roots of non-hierarchy and anti-capitalism, and just sort of calling everything mutual aid. But the people who learned about mutual aid from the New York Times weren't going to learn it from you anyway. So to me, it's kind of actually encouraging that everyone's talking about mutual aid as a way to meet each other's basic needs. So I want to be clear that market and non-market food systems are not separate, as we've seen. Like, we get a lot of our food from mutual aid from this portion of food that's always going to exist in a market food system, this edible but not sellable food. And you think about a commercial vegetable farm in Vermont, like a lot of the vegetables that are produced go home for free with farm workers, or aren't, you can't make a profit getting them out of the ground with your work, but then from farm workers, but then gleaners come and take it, and that enters the charitable food system. So a lot of non-market food comes from the market food system, but I'd also say that the market food system benefits a lot, and capitalism itself sort of parasitizes non-market food systems to the extent that when we're feeding each other for free, the wage that we need to survive is actually lower. We're feeding each other for free, and therefore we're purchasing less food than we otherwise would. And that subsidizes profits, basically. So these non-market institutions on the right, these are all really great for the current crisis. The food's there, but people don't have money. Many market institutions have shut down. But in the long term, will the food be there? I think that's an open question. Right below on Bloomberg News, right below that article about restaurant suppliers, and I just clicked on Bloomberg. I don't normally read Bloomberg News, but this was interesting. That countries are starting to hoard food. Of course. And that threatens food supplied in this like international commodity system that we have feeding the world. And you can look at a map like this that shows, green countries in green export food, produce more than they consume, and countries that are orange are net importers of food. And, it basically follows lines where countries with lots of land and resources per person are exporters of food, and countries with less land and resources per person are importers of food. And you also see sort of like the colonial legacy. Look at that. Countries in Africa, they're almost all net importers of food. They're impoverished by colonialism, and then also neo-colonial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF that in debt restructuring, poor countries restructuring their debt are forced often to produce things like coffee and cut flowers to sell to rich countries, and then import their staple crops for sustenance, which of course creates these systems of dependency that allow the global markets to perpetuate global inequality. But what's important to remember is that if countries are hoarding food and food prices in the international markets go up, that's going to hurt the poorest people in the world wherever they live. And this is sort of what got me interested in non-market food systems in the first place, this idea that even in normal times, about half of the global food supply goes to livestock and biofuel refineries in the waste stream, while about 1 billion people can't afford to feed themselves for lack of money. And so non-market food production is also really important, and that's something that I'm going to show you some fresh data from Vermont that I just got today, actually, from a poll of Vermonters. These are the percentages of households that participate in all these different local food acquisition activities, and all the ones above the four at the bottom that say bought local food are all non-market food acquisition stuff. And it's really high. Over a third of households hunt to eat, over a third fish to eat. Depending on the year, between 2/3 and 3/4 of Vermont households grow food. And this is good for like Vermont resilience and our relationships and being able to like have a lot of those mutual aid networks and self-sufficiency practices in place for when they're really important. But it's also opting out of these unjust international market systems that deliver food toward money. And so, or at least that's how I'm conceptualizing it. I'd love to hear others' thoughts on that. So, don't have much more to say besides that, because these thoughts are half-baked and conditions are evolving. But I will say that one more hypothesis I had was that, we who've discovered that our jobs are non-essential in this time and we're staying home, mutual aid is a way to feel useful and help each other out, and to keep relationships close during times of social distancing. And that's really one of the hypotheses of my research, is that non-market food systems are good for relationships, and people are doing them in pursuit of relationships as much or more than as they are in pursuit of the instrumental, the food to eat. And I got some data also the other day from a question I asked on the Vermonter poll that contradicts that a little bit in terms of we know that the mutual aid food networks of distribution are good for relationships. It feels good to give and receive gifts, both. But I asked people hypothetically, this was for the 414 people who identified as gardeners. Would you give up gardening for free deliveries of equivalent food from a local farm? And nearly half of people said yes. And then, or would you give up gardening in exchange for free care of your garden, exactly the same way you would plant, maintain, and harvest it? And almost half of people said yes, which is to say that nearly half of Vermont's gardeners, and they're really hard to find an interview because these people aren't on gardening listservs and responding to opportunities to do an interview about your garden. For a lot of people, it seems to suggest that gardening is an economic decision, and the work of gardening, rather than a benefit in itself, is a cost that they do to obtain the benefits of food and beauty. So I'll leave it there because I'm still figuring out how to interpret these results and would really love other people's thoughts on that.